Hey guys, I hope you had a great day so far. So a lot of you have been asking me to make a video on how I paint loosely but kind of realistically, and this is something that's intuitive and hard to explain, so I thought I'd record my process and then do a voiceover trying my best to explain why I do what I do so you can get a feel for it and try it out for yourself. So we're going to be painting this really cute bird, and just note that it's really about practice and I don't think about what I do when I'm painting. Overthinking definitely doesn't belong in loose pieces. But you're going to think about it a lot when you're a beginner, so don't worry about it too much and just try your best to stay loose. Over time, when you paint more and more, it'll become easier and easier to just not think about it. So references are really important, and I use my iPad. I have this adjustable tablet stand that's super small and cheap to hold the iPad up for me, and I left a link to it below if you want to get it. What I usually do is use Pinterest, or you can use Google Images, and I search a word that I want to do my subject on. So for example, in this case, a bird. I then browse until something catches my eye. Sometimes it takes no time at all, and sometimes it takes forever. Pinterest recommended me the keyword chickadee, which are actually really cute birds, so that's what I settled on. You can scroll down on an image to get similar images, and that's what I do until I find a photo I'd like to paint, which turned out to be this adorable yellow and blue one. I take a screenshot and zoom in into it and leave it like this to use as a reference. Now it's time to loosely sketch in my bird. I use blue lead, which is super light, and I don't include any detail. I just draw in the basic shapes. The only thing I focus on is correct proportions and where to place things. If it's hard for you to break down your subject into basic shapes when you draw, I recommend you take my You Can Draw Anything class, and I'll leave a link to it below. I also sketch in circles around the piece to represent where the flowers will go. I know you can barely see it, but it's a super basic and minimal sketch that took only 2 minutes, since it's important to leave out detail when painting loose. And I usually sketch like this anyway. Now on to the painting part. I start by randomly filling in an area. I chose the stomach here. Notice how it's loose because I left lots of white off the page. I also like to use a lot of water. I didn't drop in more colors, but usually I do so at this stage for a fun wet and wet technique, which is really the secret to beautiful loose pieces in watercolor. Then I painted in the blue parts of the bird. I used 3 different colors for slight variations: cobalt and peacock blue and Payne's gray. Since the colors are similar, all it does is add a little bit of interest. Notice how I keep my strokes loose and mimic a fur type of texture in some parts. I also dropped in more Payne's gray in the blue parts to make darker areas, and since the first layer is still wet, it makes beautiful blooms and soft gradients. I picked up a darker yellow and painted in the darker parts of its body. Notice how since it touched the dark line through the chest, it bled into the yellow, and that's okay. In fact, that's what I want and what makes my pieces have their trademark loose and dreamy feel. It's really just a combination of wet and bleeding. So you have to work quickly while most of the layers are still wet. I add in a splatter and will do so throughout the painting. I squint my eyes to notice darks and lights in the reference and proceed to add those in by using more paint in some areas, and for example in the face I just used a wet brush to take out some of the darker paint already on the page to make slight and loose shadows. This also softens the edges. I'm just eyeballing the bird at this stage and dropping in more paint or more water, or even adding in slight details, but I still keep it loose by working quickly. Notice how the feet had lots of white space left in them. This not only makes it loose, but shows highlights, dimension, and adds texture. After all, the white of the page is your white in watercolor. I mixed the yellow and blue to make a color similar to our color palette for the tree branch and painted it in loosely. Notice how it's very light, but then I add in Payne's gray on the bottom to give it dimension. You can't add that right away because the paper will still be too wet and it'll spread too much, so I waited a tiny bit for it to dry a little. Also, I did lighten the edges by using a wet brush. You can always do this to blend out hard edges into soft ones and make your piece even more dreamy. Now I started painting the loose florals in the background. I didn't use any references because I wanted them to be just basic flower shapes instead of certain flowers for more looseness. I painted in one big light flower shape, then dropped in dark paint in the middle, and then painted smaller flowers around the flower. Everything I'm doing here is just a play with how much water I use, how much paint I use, how dry my paper is before I add more paint. It's just a play with the water. I'm alternating between yellow and blue because that's our chosen color palette. This makes the piece feel more unified. It's okay to make rainbow pieces, and I do so all the time, but then the whole piece has to have rainbow colors or else it'll feel off. Or you could do like black and rainbow or something. Notice how I varied the scale of my flowers and let the blue and yellow ones touch, and they bleed into each other for a beautiful feel. I continue adding flowers where I sketched them earlier and even add some in that weren't sketched in, and I thought it would be cute to hint at smaller stems or branches coming out of the branch. So I painted in with a lighter color and again blend out the edges. And continue adding more flowers until it feels complete. This is just basic design principles, and I recommend you learn basic 2D graphic design to train your eye to see balance. Now this looks loose, but to make it even looser, we're going to use my super secret technique. Just kidding, it's not a secret. I use plain water to paint in the background all around the bird and flowers. This makes some of the paint bleed, but the piece is almost fully dry, so it's not much. Usually when I do this, the piece is more wet. Then I add splatter using the same colors I already used all around the piece, and this will make the background super loose and dreamy. I didn't add water perfectly everywhere. There's still tons of white of the page that isn't wet, so when splatter hits it, it will stay as dots, but in parts that are wet, it will blend out. While that's drying, I go back into the bird and add a second layer to darken some parts and define some areas. I'm careful not to overdo it with the detail, but add just enough for that slight feel of realism. I also artificially drop small amounts of paint around the bird similar to the colors that are touching the water to make it look like it bled into the background more than it did. Then I dry the piece, erase the pencil marks, and it's time to add ink. You don't have to do this, but I really like to because it ups the contrast, or you could do it with darker watercolor paint. My Pencil Arts pocket brush pen is almost dried out, so it makes a really nice texture. I have replacement cartridges, but I like the look so much that I left it like this. Notice how I don't outline it completely around, instead I use it to add texture and slight detail. If you outline it perfectly, it'll look flat and even more cartoony in a bad way. I then put on my finishing touches with my favorite white gel pen by adding little circles for a glitter look and by highlighting certain parts of the piece, and we're done. This piece was so much fun to paint and has such charm and character. I attribute that to staying loose. It took me less than 40 minutes from start to finish, and the looser you are, the faster you'll finish a painting. But keep in mind that not every painting I make like this turns out good. Remember my ugly art video? It's really trial and error, even for me. So be sure to be gentle with yourself when learning to paint loose, and when learning to paint anything or draw anything or anything creative or just anything in general. It takes time. I hope you enjoyed this sneak peek into my process, and it was a pleasure to share it with you. I left links to my classes that are relevant to this and the supplies used below, and if you want a certain video on a certain topic, just leave a comment and I'll add it to the list. As always, stay awesome guys and have fun on your creative journey. I'll see you in the next video.